From the heartland of the United States and one of the leading children's medical centers in the world, welcome to the Children's Mercy Kansas City Pediatric Bioethics webinar series. We invite international leaders to discuss critical and controversial issues in bioethics. Now, from the Bioethics Conference Center on the Adele Hall campus, here's Dr. John Lantos.
Hello. Actually, Dr. Lantos is away from the hospital today, and I am Angie Noxted, also with the Bioethics Center, and we're here to welcome you today to the 2016-17 Children's Mercy Bioethics webinar series with topics in pediatrics. We also always want to be grateful to recognize our financial support of the Claire Giannini Trust and Children's Mercy Hospital. They make this all possible. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to just remind you that we're also now accepting applications to our certificate program in pediatric bioethics, our online program that is open to all practicing clinicians in pediatrics so that they can communicate about bioethics with folks from all over the world. As a part of the program, we do have scholarships for students in low-income countries, as well as an innovative nurse leadership program. Please visit our website to check out these opportunities. Also, we have some more upcoming webinars in the next few weeks. Vicki Foreman, the author of This Lovely Life, a beautifully written memoir about her experiences as a mother of a premature infant. Also later in the year, Ray DeVries and Ann Hamrick and Lainey Ross are some of our other webinar speakers. But today we're very excited to have Dr. Perri Klass join us. She's a pediatrician who writes fiction and nonfiction. She's written on various subjects related to children's and family, medicine, also about food and knitting. So we're very excited to have her talk with us today. Her newest book is a novel entitled The Mercy Rule. Before that was a book about the work of nonfiction, which was Treatment of Kind and Fair, Letters to a Young Doctor, which she was also giving to her son who was starting medical school. So she lives in New York, but she's come to visit us here in Kansas City, where in New York she's a professor of journalism and pediatrics at New York University. And she has 3 children of her own. She also is the National Medical Director for Reach Out and Read, which is a national literacy organization that works through doctors and nurses to help promote literacy with children through their parents who read aloud to them. Today, though, her topic is Saving Tiny Tim, Pediatrics and Childhood Poverty. Please join us as she gives us a 30-minute presentation, and then join us for the open discussion where all of you can submit questions for her on our chat, in your chat area, or the question and answer area of WebEx. Just type them in and we'll forward those to her at the end of her presentation. Dr. Klass?
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as you heard, I'm going to talk about poverty as a childhood disease, but I have to warn you that first of all, I have nothing to disclose, but second of all, that this is really not going to be a Child Poverty 101 talk, because I'm not really qualified to give that talk. What I want to talk about today has more to do with the stories that we tell ourselves around child poverty, with how those stories play out for healthcare providers in the exam room, and through that, the question of how we understand the impact that growing up in poverty does have on children's health, and the responsibility that those of us who are concerned with children's health have to think about, address, and encompass childhood poverty as an issue for the kids we take care of. Having said that, of course, I'm starting with the Childhood Poverty 101 slide just to give everyone a little reminder of the scope of the problem and also of some of the terminology that we use. This slide from Child Trends traces 3 different indicators. This is children living at or under 100% of the poverty line in the United States. That is to say, over time, the children who we refer to as living in poverty. Up above, you see the children who are living under 200% of the poverty line. Those are the children who are sometimes referred to as low income. 100% of the poverty line qualifies as a family living in poverty, 200% is low income, and then down here, children who are living in what is sometimes called extreme or deep poverty, families living at less than half of the income that we consider child poverty. But if we just go back to the children living under 100% of the poverty line, what we see over time is a high here in around 1993, almost 23% of the children in this country living in poverty, and then, encouragingly, a steady decline until the end of the 1990s. We're talking only about 16% of the children in this country. It starts to creep up again slowly, and then we hit the economic downturn, and it goes back up to 22%, 21%, which is where it stays today. The other point to make when we talk about childhood poverty is why childhood poverty as opposed to overall poverty? And the point to be made about that is that specific interventions, specific goals around different age groups can actually matter. And just to remind people that if we look back in time, we see poverty very high among the elderly, and that thanks to government programs, initiatives, services, you can actually drive poverty in a particular age group, here notably among the elderly. You can serve that age group by targeting the services they need, the problems that get in their way, by promoting programs which actually address both the income that they earn, which is something that happened in this country, but also the services they receive. So it actually does make sense when you think about poverty to look at the different age groups and what affects both their income and their necessary expenditure. But having said that, I want to go back now and talk about a couple of famous and persistent narratives that we hear in our culture around children in poverty. The first is the Hans Christian Andersen story from the middle of the 19th century, The Little Match Girl. And I'm showing you all of these covers, in a sense, in these illustrations to show you how pervasive and persistent and in some way, obviously, appealing this particular narrative is. It's a story which doesn't disappear, which comes back again and again, about a poor little girl out in the snow responsible for selling matches. It's New Year's Eve and it's the city, and it's the 19th century. The flakes of snow covered her long fair hair, which fell in beautiful curls around her neck, but of that, of course, she never once now thought. From all the windows the candles were gleaming, and it smelt so deliciously of roast goose, for you know it was New Year's Eve. Yes, of that she thought. In a corner formed by two houses, of which one advanced more than the other, she seated herself down and cowered together. Her little feet she had drawn close up to her, but she grew colder and colder, and to go home she did not venture, for she had not sold any matches and could not bring a farthing of money. From her father she would certainly get blows, and at home it was cold too, for above her she had only the roof through which the wind whistled, even though the largest cracks were stopped up with straw and rags. And here she is, huddling behind a wall to keep warm barefoot in the snow. I'm sorry, go back to her. So what are we hearing in this story in the 19th century? We're hearing very clearly that in your cities, while you roast your goose, there are very hungry children very close by, right outside your windows. What else are we hearing in this story? Well, when you think about the fact that this is a story that's being told in the 19th century, before we had really any words for this in our discourse, we're also being told that she's afraid to go home because her father will beat her. There's an awareness of what some of the economic pressures may be, but also some of the family circumstances. It's meant to be a very sad story. The little match girl is not going to survive the night, but it's also meant to be clearly a story that's meant to make you a little uncomfortable as you eat your own roast goose. Let's take a look at another narrative from a little later in the 19th century. This is an American, and in fact, some people would say a very American narrative. It's the Horatio Alger story, Ragged Dick. It's from 1868. It's also an urban narrative. It's a narrative about homeless children, shoeshine boys, newspaper boys who sleep on the street in the city. But it's a Horatio Alger story, and we use that to mean a story about, taking control of your life and, making it because of your gumption. But let's take a look for a minute at what it's going to take for the hero, Ragged Dick, this homeless bootblack boy living on the street, to make it. Our hero took his bank book and gazed on the entry $5 with a new sense of importance. He had been accustomed to joke about eerie shares, but now, for the first time, he felt himself a capitalist. On a small scale, to be sure, but still, it was no small thing for Dick to have $5, which he could call his own. He firmly determined that he would lay by every cent he could spare from his earnings towards the fund he hoped to accumulate. But Dick was too sensible not to know that there was something more than money needed to win a respectable position in the world. He felt that he was very ignorant. Of reading and writing, he only knew the rudiments, and that, with a slight acquaintance with arithmetic, was all he did know of books. Dick knew he must study hard, and he dreaded it. He looked upon learning as attended with greater difficulties than it really possesses. But Dick had good pluck. He meant to learn nevertheless, and resolved to buy a book with his first spare earnings. So again, Horatio Alger, we usually think of these stories as parables of capitalism in the 19th century. They're about pluck and honesty, right? Very usefully, the hero often saves the life of someone who turns out to be a millionaire who can help him along his way. But the virtues that that child has, he's willing to save, he's willing to delay gratification. Instead of buying shoes for his barefoot feet, he's willing to put the money in the bank and save. And he knows that the biggest barrier he's got to overcome is he's got to get an education. And this again is a story about what's going on the streets here in your city, where there are children sleeping on the streets. Its subtitle when it was published in 1868 was "Or Street Life in New York with the Bootblacks," and it's about children with no one to care for them living here in your city, sir, shining your shoes. And part of the message of the book is obviously to suggest that you look carefully at that ragged boy who shines your shoes. And then finally, my third, and the one I want to come back to, is probably the most famous poor child in all literature, and that's Tiny Tim. And here he is on the shoulder of his father, Bob Cratchit. Here he is, and you'll see certain commonalities in the illustration because Charles Dickens, the author of Christmas Carol, was a very good reporter, and he put in lots of details, and we know a lot about Tiny Tim and what he had going for him and what he had going against him. And again, just to remind you of the wild, you've seen every possible version of this, and I'll come back to this again. This is a narrative that people love. It's a narrative that has survived over 100 years, that has been dramatized, made into a movie, made into a musical, made into a cartoon, made into another movie, made into another musical, made into another cartoon. It's very familiar. But what do we know about Tiny Tim? We know he has a crutch. One crutch. He's got a problem on one side. We know he's very small for his age. His growth is literally stunted. That's why he's Tiny Tim. We know that he's cognitively okay. We know that he can talk and make conversation. We know a fair amount about him. And in fact, there is an interesting medical literature in which doctors have tried to figure out what was wrong with him. Because again, Dickens was a reporter. He didn't make things up. So there's been an interesting discussion in the pediatric literature of what was the underlying pathophysiology. And I'm going to come back to why this is so important. But again, he's a sort of compelling figure, compelling as a story, compelling for people who want to produce certain kinds of pageantry and fiction, but also even compelling as a medical conundrum. What made Tiny Tim tiny? What stunted his growth? What crippled him? What's going on in his life? And here he is again with his crutch on his father. So let's come back to real poverty, because that's going to turn out to be really crucial in Tiny Tim's story. Let's go back to what poverty means today for us. I showed you that slide at the beginning. So that poverty line in 2014 is a 2014 cash income before taxes of $24,008 for a family of four. And you can do the math for yourself how much that means a week or a day or per child. But so that's how the poverty line is defined. Notice that it's being defined just by cash income. And there are many people who say that you'll get a better estimate of child poverty if you factor in the question of, is there health care available? What are some of the baseline baseline expenses that that family will have to pay, because what you do or don't have to spend out of that $24,000 obviously has a tremendous impact on how you live. And then, as I said, extreme poverty is the annual income that's less than half of the poverty level. To review a few familiar truths about poverty in childhood. Families with children have higher poverty rates. That goes back to that other graph I showed you. Poverty can be more or less prevalent in different age groups. Families with children are more likely to be poor, and the younger you are, we think, the more vulnerable you are to the effects of poverty on your development. And therefore, it's worth saying not only families with children are more likely to be poor, but families with younger children are even more likely, have higher rates of poverty than family with older children. And young children are also more likely to be living in extreme poverty. Here are 2014 figures from the Center for Childhood Poverty. If you look at family income according to the age of the child in 2014, you will see that children who are less than 3 years old are more likely to be both poor and low income than children who are less than 18, in other words, than families with older children. And again, that people who are living without children a little less likely, and elderly people a little less likely. The other truth we know about childhood poverty is it is more prevalent in African American and Hispanic families than in the non-Hispanic white family group. And finally, what we know about child poverty is that there's no simple cause and effect between poverty and any of the problems I'm going to discuss. None of this is easy, but what we do know is that there are some of the connections between growing up in poverty. It means you're more likely to be growing up in a dangerous neighborhood. It means you're more likely to have parents who are working multiple jobs and under, by definition, different kinds of economic stress, and that you're more likely to be growing up in the setting of certain kinds of high parental stress levels. We know that you're more at risk to have poorer child care options, less high-quality child care. We know that there's more limited access to health care and to mental health services. We know you're at higher risk for stressed and overburdened schools, at higher risk for food insecurity, and at higher risk, depending on your family background, to be facing issues of family separation and immigration. Let's look at a few of the medical conditions or conditions which can have an impact on your physical health, which have been linked to poverty. Prematurity and premature birth, which is something I know you've talked about here and we'll talk about again. Chronic diseases, which in childhood especially asthma, linked to poverty. Obesity, childhood obesity, and also food insecurity, leading to the paradox of children who are quote unquote overfed and undernourished. And we know that you're at higher risk for accidental injury. I'm going to talk very quickly. This isn't going to be a thorough analysis of any one of those complicated issues, but I'm going to bring up some of the questions that have been brought up. Poverty is associated with a higher prevalence of asthma, probably the most common chronic disease that we deal with in our exam rooms on a daily basis, with children being at risk not just for higher rates of asthma, but for more frequent hospitalizations and a higher death rate. And here, if you look, is one chart from 2008-2010 asthma prevalence, and you can see that less than 100% poverty, higher than 100 to less than 200%, higher than 200% of the poverty line. What are some of the ideas that have been put forward to explain this link or to connect these issues? The high cost of the medicine and of high copays, lower health insurance, poorer primary care, poorer preventive care, but also higher risk of exposure to smoking, higher risk of exposure to some of the precipitants that you find in poor housing, from mold to cockroaches, obesity, which is separately linked to poverty, but also linked to asthma, low birth weight and prematurity, which is again separately linked to poverty and also to asthma. Let's switch over and talk a little bit about childhood obesity and that apparent paradox. As family income increases, childhood obesity decreases. Most obese children in this country are not low income. Childhood obesity is not only a problem of poverty, neither is asthma. but there is a connection in terms of risk. But I would just, say, in particularly around childhood obesity, that's something which has increased over the past decades in families of all income levels. It's not strictly a problem of poverty, but there is a connection. And if you look at diabetes, one of the complications linked to childhood obesity that we worry about most, you can find, again, correlations that risk gets higher as you go from the wealthy families to the poor families in rates of sedentary lifestyle and in rates of diabetes. This is something that's been written about and worried about, the fact that children growing up in poverty have even higher rates of obesity, even higher rates of type 2 diabetes. Last, I want to talk about poverty and the developing brain. So I've talked a little bit about the lungs, I've talked a little bit about the body, and I want to talk about the developing brain. Why do we worry so much about the developing brain? Do we worry that poverty may somehow damage or constrain the child's relationships, which are so critical in child development? Do we worry that poverty can constrain the parent's ability to provide the kind of environment in which the child's brain can develop optimally? Do we worry that poverty can result in high levels of toxic stress, both for children and for their parents? These are 3 ideas put forward by the Harvard Center on the Developing Child for how poverty may act to make trouble for children as they develop. I'll say a word about the stress response. We talk now about toxic stress so much in pediatrics. Let me just define it for you. We talk about 3 levels of stress. One is positive stress, which I'm always obliged to say that's me giving a talk here, aware of the clock ticking. So, I'm paying attention, I'm on hyper alert, I'm watching the clock but it's good for me, we all think, or you're enjoying it. The second would be tolerable stress, which is more prolonged and more severe, but time limited, and if buffered for a child by the adult relationships, there's a stress response, but it's time limited and it's buffered and your brain and your organs will recover. And then finally, the idea that if you have strong, frequent, prolonged adversity, turning on all of those stress mechanisms without sufficient adult support and buffering, that it is not good for your developing body and your developing brain to live in that state of constant stress response. I'm sure you've talked a lot about the question of adverse childhood experiences, and this is, again, not just an issue of poverty. In fact, these original studies were done in a middle-class, middle-income population, but the risk of being exposed to many adverse childhood experiences, again, goes up with poverty. So everything that we have to worry about for all the kids we take care of, we have to worry even more about the children who are growing up in poverty, that the risk of having experienced more than three or more adverse experiences is higher for the children living in poverty than it is for the children not living in poverty, and higher still for the children living in extreme poverty. What do we think this does? We think that the prolonged activation of the stress response, the neuroendocrine response to that hyperalert adverse state, can actually disrupt the development of the brain architecture, can increase the risk of all kinds of adult diseases, and can increase the risk of cognitive problems and learning difficulties. So what do we do to mitigate that? Again, not just for children in poverty, but for all children. We think about the supportive relationships which can buffer toxic stress, even for children growing up in high-risk environments. We also think about what helps children develop the emotional vocabulary they need to talk about the situations in which they find themselves and to ask for help when they need it. And we also think with children always about the routines, which can, even in a setting in which adults know that there is adversity and there is risk, we know that for young children, routines can create a certain amount of security and a certain amount of reassurance and constancy. So that brings me to the question of language and brain development and early literacy, because I'm going to circle around to my own obsession, which is language development, reading aloud, and the question of the role that books can play, not because it's going to answer all of the questions I've raised or even any of the questions I've raised, but because it's going to take us very specifically into the exam room and then finally back to stories. What goes into speech and language development for children? Oh, it's a whole lot of things. It's environmental stimulation, it's vocabulary, it's rhyming, it's all of the things that children do to figure out language, but it's also memory. Memory is hugely important in everything children learn, starting with and including always language. And we know that memory development is not a function only of a stimulating environment, but is very particularly tied to parental nurturing behaviors. And there are really interesting studies on the hippocampus, which is hugely important in memory, to show the ways that it relates not to parental education, not to vocabulary stimulation, but to the nurturing and emotional behaviors. So language, we can't separate things out and say language, that's cognitive, that's vocabulary, children need a rich cognitive environment, and then something else. It's also emotional, it's social emotional, it's nurturing. And beyond all of that, it's the question of attentional skills and executive function. And what all of this comes back to is parent-child interactions. Children learn in the context of responsive, contingent interactions with their parents, which foster speech, but also foster memory and social emotional development. We need face time, we need lap time, we need language, we need the social emotional, and that's going to bring me back to my obsession, which is dialogic reading and the question of how we can help parents make those responses. Since I'm here in Kansas City, I have to reference the Hart-Risley study, since it happened here, which was the prospective study done here in which observers were sent into the homes of children growing up at different income levels, who recorded all of the language that those children heard. And this was back in the days when recording it meant writing it down. And it is from this study that we get the idea of the 30 million word gap, the idea that by the age 3, the children who were growing up in the poorer families, the families on government assistance, had heard 30 million words less than cumulatively than the children growing up in the higher income families. And that we could tie this, or that they could tie this, to the disparities in the numbers of words spoken by those children, and those disparities started to appear before the second birthday. The children as young as 15 months, 18 months, which is pretty much as early as you can test for language, were speaking fewer words if they were growing up in the poor families, and that those gaps then continued to widen as the children grew into the preschool years toward the age of 3, and that you could draw a pretty impressive connection between the total number of words spoken by the child at the age of 3 and the average number of words per hour spoken to the child, and that was pretty directly tied to income level. And I want to just say one word about a newer study which has helped tease out again what is connected to poverty. What do we see as some of the different mechanisms? I'm not explaining cause and effect. I'm looking at what are, as we tease it out finer and finer, what are some of the differences we see. And this was a study done by researchers at Stanford University on language processing skill. And what they were looking at was, okay, we'll look at vocabulary size, but let's look at how children handle the words they know. We'll find out from parents which are the words children know, and then we'll hold up 2 pictures and we'll say, where's the car? And whatever the income level, we'll be using a word that child knows, but we'll measure how quickly the child finds the car, how quickly the child goes from hearing the word car to looking at the picture of the car. So this is processing skill. It's how you process the words you know, and tracking gaze. And what they found was that not only were there those differences in vocabulary, according to socioeconomic status, and they were there, but the differences in language processing efficiency were present by 18 months. By 18 months, the wealthier children were processing the words they knew faster than the poorer children, and by 24 months, there was a 6-month gap. The 18-month-olds growing up in the wealthy families could process as fast as the 24-month-olds growing up in poverty. This is the vocabulary, again, showing you the higher SES means a larger vocabulary, but this is the processing skill, and what you see here is the overlap between the 18-month-olds growing up in wealthier families and the 24-month-olds growing up in poorer families, giving you a sense, it's not just the number of words you know, something different is happening in your brain in terms of how fast you process them, which is going to have an impact on how you hear the language spoken around you and how efficiently you can learn new words, and begins to give us a sense of what is spiraling there as the discrepancies get bigger and bigger. So how does SES shape development? Well, one important thing I think to remind ourselves of is that achievement is not, cognitive development and achievement are no one simple thing. And I love this quote: achievement is the complex output of multiple cognitive systems, which are all supported by different brain regions and networks. So we have traced differences according to SES in language, in memory, in social emotional processing, in cognitive control. It's not only is poverty complicated, but the effects on the brain and on learning are very, very complex. We know that there are disparities. We know that it's not just the number of words, that it's the kinds of utterances. We also know that early childhood vocabularies predict later vocabularies in school achievement. And we know that it's processing that plays a role there too. I'm just going to mention one other study because it was a huge one. The Millennium Cohort study, more than 12,000 children in Britain. Again, they found that children from the poorest homes were nearly a year behind. But since I'm working up to talk about reading, let me point out that one thing they found was that daily reading at the age of 3 improved vocabulary development by nearly 2 months, and that monthly library visits increased vocabulary development. Good parenting practices reduced the achievement gap, but children from the poorest homes were also less likely to be read to every day. But I just want to say again, speech and language, it's not just what we're testing, it's also the tool that the child has to get what he or she needs out of the environment, out of the school, out of the preschool. It's a predictor of school success, but it's also the mediator that you use to ask the world for what you need in order to learn. So finally, I want to say a word about Reach Out and Read, which is a program that you referenced at the beginning, which we carry out in primary care, in which we give anticipatory guidance at health supervision visits about reading aloud and building routines and how to enjoy books in a developmentally appropriate way with babies and toddlers and preschoolers. We give a developmentally and culturally appropriate book at every health visit up till 5 years, and we enrich the waiting rooms to be more about literacy and to give parents information. We're serving a lot of children. We're serving more than 4.5 million children in the United States through 21,000 trained medical providers at more than 5,600 sites. And the reason to me this is one way of trying to get at this issue is because we're addressing written language, but we're also addressing spoken language. The early brain is designed to learn language. We've got a window here. It's a way to help parents give the kind of stimulation at 6 months old, choose books. But it's a way to help parents help their children develop those early literacy skills, like handling books and processing pictures and understanding stories, which all involve parent-child reciprocity, contingency, and that social emotional connection, which is another way to say it happens in a parent's lap, because a parent's voice is reading the book and explaining the world. This is one of our books that we give out to 6-month-olds. It's chewable, it's a board book, it's about faces. And that by encouraging reading aloud, we're exposing children to more language and responsive interactions, and we're fostering memory, and we're building positive associations so that children come to school. When they see a book, they think about being in a parent's lap, feeling safe, hearing a parent's voice. We know that children who are read to are more likely to learn to read on schedule, more likely to succeed in school, less likely to fall behind and fail. But I want you to understand that when we do this in the exam room, we're asking a lot of parents, because the intervention in the exam room is not going to do anything for the child. What makes it work depends on the parents and the ability to go home and read with their children. Well, do the parents have the reading skills? Do we successfully convey the importance? Do the children have the behavioral and developmental skills to listen and to participate? When we talk about home routines and building stable routines, is the home stable enough for there to be routines, or are there things getting in the way? Do you have bedtime rituals? Do you have bedtimes? Can you accommodate rituals? Can you take this on and do it at home, and what can get in the way? We know that if we do this as providers in primary care, that parents will read aloud. This is a randomized prospective study. We know that the parents who get this intervention are more likely to read aloud more days a week. We know that the children who get this intervention, and these are high-risk urban children, will have a 6-month improvement in their receptive language skills in the preschool years, and a 3-month improvement in their expressive language skills in the preschool years. So we know that we can at least move those dials a little bit. And that's a reminder to us of the opportunity that we have in pediatric primary care to reinforce the connections between health and development, and to think about taking on child poverty as a pediatric issue. Dr. Dreyer, who's the current president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, brought this up at the end of his year as president of the Academic Pediatric Association, when he made a speech called The Case for Ending Childhood Poverty, and took on the question of how can we talk about children's health without at least trying to encompass and do something about the effects of childhood poverty. There was an Academic Pediatric Association task force on childhood poverty. It became part of the American Academy of Pediatrics agenda for children, so that in addition, when we look at some of the main agenda items, which include early brain and child development, poverty and child health was right up there. And it's been a huge issue for us, I think, in a very, very salutary way in pediatrics over the last several years, largely thanks to the ways that these large organizations have tried to take on the problem and think about it. So I want to come back to Tiny Tim then as a pediatric issue. Why is Tiny Tim so interesting as a medical case? Well, Tiny Tim is so interesting as a medical case because in the 19th century, if you fix poverty, Tiny Tim will get better. That's why he's so interesting. That's why the doctors are trying to figure out what's wrong with him. It's not only got to be something which is stunting his growth, which is crippling him, and in fact, which we hear, here are some of you, my more obscure Tiny Tims. There's Mickey Mouse's Tiny Tim. There's the Muppet Tiny Tim. There he is again with Bob Cratchit. What's going to happen to Tiny Tim if nobody intervenes? Whatever's wrong with him, it's going to kill him. Okay, here's Christmas present. God bless us. You know the story. Scrooge is looking at Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas yet to come. Here's Christmas present. God bless us, everyone, said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side and dreaded that he might be taken from him. Spirit, said Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before, tell me if Tiny Tim will live. I see a vacant seat, replied the ghost, in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. So whatever is wrong with Tiny Tim medically, it's going to kill him. And then, in fact, we see it happen in the future. Scrooge is there in the future, and we see his father come in, and his mother says, this is about Bob Cratchit, Tiny Tim's father. I've known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. And so have I, cried Peter often, and so have I, exclaimed another, so had all. But he was very light to carry, she resumed, intent upon his work, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble, no trouble. And there is your father at the door. And then down at the bottom you say, Bob Cratchit talks about going to church. It would have done you good. He's been to the grave to see how green a place it is, but you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child, cried Bob, my little child. Okay, so we know what will happen to this child medically if nobody changes it. But somebody changes it. Scrooge decides, he undergoes his Christmas Eve conversion, and what does he do? He raises Bob's salary. Remember, that's what he does. He buys food for the family, but the long-term intervention is he raises his salary, and the child doesn't die. So in the 19th century, without antibiotics, without a whole lot of medical stuff, something has to be wrong with this child, which can be cured if you raise the family income. What is stunting him and what is killing him is poverty, and that's what makes it an interesting medical question. Here's the end of the story. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more, and to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. Okay? So what can you do? It's something in the nutrition, it's something in the diet, it's something in the family. That's what makes it interesting. Now, Charles Dickens, this is where I'm going to end, he was a ham. He barnstormed around England. He barnstormed around the United States giving readings. He read the most exciting, dramatic passages from Oliver Twist, and he wrote letters the next day boasting that, 3 ladies had fainted and they'd had to be carried out. He loved it. He played to his audience. He gave dramatic readings. It was 19th century entertainment, and he read that Christmas Carol passage that I just read, and here's a letter that he wrote in 1855. Okay, he's talking about his lectures. Enormous effect at Sheffield, but really not a better audience perceptively than at Peterborough, for that could hardly be. But they were more enthusiastically demonstrative, and they took the line, and to Tiny Tim, who did not die, with a most prodigious shout and roll of thunder. So the moral in this particular narrative of child poverty, it's not just be aware of who's in your cities, be aware what's happening. It's also a narrative it's also a story about what you have to do to change the narrative. Poor children belong to poor parents. They don't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. You can change the course of what's going on, but you have to, this is a child who is being stunted and in this story killed by poverty. You change the narrative by changing the circumstances so that he does not grow up in poverty. And finally, then, the last connection I want to make between literacy and the stories of child poverty is that, for me, one of the strongest messages of promoting reading to children, promoting early literacy skills, hoping that we can promote children's success in school, is this underlying idea that you need these skills in order to write your own story the way you want it to be. We stop here and take questions.
Thank you very much. I think that was amazing. And so now we will turn to questions, but first I'm going to throw out one because the Reach Out and Read is could you tell the folks how they can get involved either locally or learn more about the program?
Go to our website, reachoutandread.org. You can go state by state, community by community. You can find out what practices are doing it near you, whether there is a coalition in your state or area, how you can get involved, how you can apply for your practice to be part of it. Anything we can do for you, we'll do.
Okay, terrific. Do we have any questions from the audience that's present today?
I'll start off with one. Amazing presentation. Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more. The emphasis on the books and the face-to-face and the narrative and those personal interactions. But then I turn and I look at my children's own schools, and I'm seeing iPads and the phasing out of books. In fact, I've been told next year we won't even have the option to have a textbook. It'll all be online and apps. And so can you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems like a huge contradiction to what your program and what would be better for our children.
Well, I'm not sure it's a contradiction in the sense that one of the things that we know in this age of the internet is that not being literate, not being able to manipulate words on the page, on the screen is actually even more crippling than it used to be. It's one of the things we talk about a lot in the information economy, the way that children are left even further behind, the way that it is now much harder to be a child, to be an adult who isn't easily able to work with words, to get around on the internet, to get around. So when I'm thinking about books for young children, now my heart is with books. I love books, and I still read on the page, and I have adult colleagues who are constantly explaining to me that I could read on a device, and I read scientific journals on a device. I mean, I don't want to own those on the page, but my heart is with books. But no, do I think if you've got a teenager who is reading his books on the screen, his textbook on the screen, who is learning from text on the screen, but that teenager who's doing that can probably find things with words, look, search, maneuver around on the internet much better than I can. We are in, because of the internet, literacy in words, the accessibility is huge, but the skill level is also vital. When we talk about books for very young children and Reach Out and Read, we're talking about infants up to the age of 5. There are a bunch of reasons why I think we stick with books on the page. We stick with books on the page, first of all, because they're going to eat them, and they're going to throw them on the floor. But more than that, we stick with books on the page because the only way that baby can find out what that chicken says is by indicating interest in that chicken so that the adult makes the bok, bok, bok noise, right? We don't want that baby to have the option of tapping the picture of the chicken and writing the adult out of the picture. We want, for young children, we want the books to, the child has to give the book to a parent to make the book work. And we all know the children are going to be great with the screens. The other thing, of course, as far as the screens and the iPads, from the point of view of young children, is none of us worry that young children, and this includes young children growing up in poverty, are going to have any trouble working the screens. Children they're going to get good at it. That's fine, but what we have with books is an opportunity to give the child something which the child can use to get that face time with the parent and that interaction with the parent.
I have a question. Actually, a couple of comments. Fabulous presentation. I think that your work really reinforces that libraries are still very important institutions, and they typically have children's areas, so just even going to the library as sort of a process is very important. And then the second comment I had, if you remember the book Freakonomics, the author notes that just the presence of books in a home actually has a correlation to kids having better outcomes. And I don't remember the exact statistics on that, but I thought that was fascinating, just the presence of books. So I was kind of wondering how you connect maybe parents to the Reach Out and Read. The kiddos are getting books and the parents are reading those books, but is there any do you give the parents like parenting books that might be useful for them to read, or I'm just kind of wondering if that's connected?
It hasn't been a part of the program. We do give the parents information and tips and ideas where they might go on the web to look for parenting information. And again, of course, we worry most that this is a most important message for the parents who may be least comfortable with written material themselves. So we think a lot about what's accessible and what's not intimidating. I remember at some point somebody sent me some material that had been done on, how to be a good parent, how to read to your child, and it was formulated as a test. Test yourself. The best way to read to a child is, A, B, C, D. And I was thinking this is probably going to be most intimidating for the parents where you would most like to inform. But so couldn't agree more about the library and about what trouble libraries go to be accessible, to have books in different languages and it's just, we have a lot of collaborations with libraries, including a national collaboration with the Institute for Museum and Library Services, because libraries like the Children's Museums are really eager and really welcoming. They want the families who don't easily find their way there. But the other thing, of course, that question about books in the home is a really interesting one, because we don't think it's that having books in the home magically makes you. We think there's a correlation between being the families who somehow get books into their home. But there have been a bunch of studies to suggest that, for example, again, with Reach Out and Read, that if you have families participating in the program and then you go back and do a home study a few years later, the families where the children are getting books from the doctor have more books in the home later on. They don't just have the 2 or 3 books you got from the doctor, they have other books, and they, in one study, actually also had more adult books. Again, you have to sort of think about where families are living, what's available, what's accessible. Are there bookstores in the neighborhood? Are these going to be things that come people's way, or are they going to actually have to change patterns and take some initiative? But one way we always used to joke that, maybe if you've only got 2 books in the home, maybe when you really get sick of reading that book over and over and over and over and over, maybe that's what stimulates you to go to the library and get some new books into the home. And then, of course, as we all know, regardless of parent education, your 2-year-old will still insist on hearing the book that you swore you would never read again.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm just wondering how your experience has been with the parents of poor families, because I'm just wondering if one of the parent or both parents, if any one of them cannot read, how would they, feel taking a book home, or maybe, I'm just wondering how you experience.
I think that's a very important question, but I want to step back a little from it and say, if I'm taking care of a child as the pediatrician and the parents truly cannot read, then there's a lot more going on in terms of my role as the healthcare provider than whether they're going to read the book that I've given for bedtime. I need to step back and say, what about my asthma action plan? And what about when I carefully wrote down which creams you put on when? And what about that safety information sheet that I gave that had all of that very important safe sleep information? So I think it's a great question, but I think actually there's an obligation to us to think about that from a large number, from the health literacy point of view. And I think it's a huge question. I think it's probably something we should be screening for. But of course, if we're going to screen for it, we have to have something to offer. And so one of the things we've tried to do with Reach Out and Read is encourage collaboration because one thing is clear: as pediatricians, we're not going to teach the parents to read. That's huge undertaking, requires a whole other skill set and level of commitment. And it's not a small commitment for the parents, but I think it's definitely, it's a risk factor for the kids. It's an important issue. We ought to be looking for it in a non-judgmental way. We ought to have a referral that we can make. We ought to be willing to make the referral again and again. So that's the larger context. In this more specifically in the read aloud context, there's a lot you can do. You can talk about looking at books with the child rather than reading. You can start out with books that have one word on a page or no word on a page, or counting books where it's, 1 apple, 2 dogs, and parent can find a way to talk about it. And especially with the younger children, you're not really asking the parent to read through the book from beginning to end. You're saying open, and this is what you model in the exam. You open the book, point to the pictures, talk about what you see. So I think it's those things together. It's acknowledging that it's huge and it's a risk factor, and we ought to look for it and we ought to address it. But it's also saying to the parent, she wants to be on your lap. She wants to hear your voice. You're the center of her world. And when you look at the book with her and you tell her what the pictures are and you name things and you talk, then you're helping her love books, and that's going to matter later on.
Do we have any questions from online?
Not at this time, but I do have another comment, and I'm, thinking of what we were just asked. But there are some apps that will, take you through a book, and there's a nice narrator, and a lot of times they're folk tales that you've never heard before, and there can be really some fabulous ones. I think that can be nice, like if you're combining them with also having a parent read aloud. Of course, anything about the access to tablets and devices that can do that sort of functionality. So there's just more of a comment that I think is kind of a nice addition to all the options that we have as parents today.
So other comments or questions?
I was really struck by one of your first graphs that showed over time the decline in poverty in the elderly due to the social contributions, and that hasn't affected child poverty.
No.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Again, I'm no expert, but as I understand it, when we look at what happened to poverty in the elderly, we're talking about 2 different things. We're talking about income, Social Security, and guaranteeing a certain reliable income for elderly people, which persists as long as they live. And we're talking about providing health care benefits so that people who are elderly and often will have medical issues are not required to spend a huge portion of what in some cases are fixed incomes on medical care. And, I mean, honestly, haven't we come to feel that that is part of being a civilized society, is taking care of people? And the argument would be that we haven't quite made those same decisions around children, that certain services need to be provided and that the children are entitled to them, and that we need to think about what kind of income allows a family to take proper care of young children.
And I think along those lines, just real quickly, was the CHIPS program is probably the one program for children across the board, across the
Yep.
nation that has been in that line. Unfortunately, other programs are based out of the states who there's different opinions and different states take that different approach. So
We have some questions from our online audience. So Dr. Ruby Payne's book on a framework for understanding poverty is in agreement with your presentation. But the person that's commenting says that Dr. Payne also argues that there are hidden rules in each class that, once understood, will give people and parents the understanding of being able to move from poverty. And since the AAP is sort of a run-on here, is started to address childhood poverty, should pediatricians begin to address these hidden rules and anticipatory guidance?
I'm too ignorant to answer this question because I don't know the hidden rules. But I mean, I do think, and I'm going to answer this honestly without telling you that I don't know what the hidden rules are here. But I do think I'll take the opportunity to say that I think one of the mistakes we make is we look at poverty as a single entity, and that the more closely you look at the patterns and the different stories, people have a lot of different complicated stories explaining why they are where they are. There's no one way in, there's no one way out, there's no, you can't lump everyone together. And the more you understand about the individual trajectories and the individual circumstances, I think the more able you are to ask people, which is part of what you've got to do, what would help? What do you need? What's getting in your way? Rather than, the idea that you can come in with sort of some simple fixes.
So we have several questions coming in. Are there studies looking at poverty and toxic stress and the characteristics of pediatric assent? I understand that it could affect children developmentally, but do poor or stressed children have a different threshold to assent? If so, is it a true assent?
Well, I mean, one of the issues that would come up just around the issue of pediatric assent is once you start looking at stress in different children and the children who may be asked to assent to different things medically, you go into the question of a bunch of children with a whole bunch of medical stresses. And I mean, this is something you guys must have thought about and talked about much more than I do, but do you generally feel that a child who has been increasingly stressed by major illness is more or less able to assent? What do you say? You must have discussed this.
I think we have. I think that it really does. Again, it goes back to that individual child, knowing them and understanding what their stresses are and being able then to weigh what information. But I still think having that trust between the provider and the child and the family has to come into play to see where that child is and to discuss their understanding and then asking if they do agree with that or not.
And I think there are a lot of things we know the onus is on us as providers to make sure that we're explaining what we're doing in such a way that we are reaching across some of the many barriers, cultural and to people understanding what we're doing. We know we haven't always done a very good job of this. I think poverty, like cultural differences, complicates this, but I think it puts more of an obligation on us to explain what we're doing in a way that it can actually be understood, not just by the people in our own insular culture.
I'm going to finish with a relatively, I think, what might be an easy question here. This is from a practitioner that says that they have seen two unrelated children, ages 18 months and 22 months, in their clinic recently who have no interest in books. I have tried to model at previous visits, the practitioner says, and tried again very recently. The children throw the books and they arch the backs of themselves. How can we help these parents?
Well, so the first question I would ask about any story like this is this the only neurodevelopmental issue that you're seeing? That is to say, I'm sort of going back in my mind to the MCHAT, and I'm saying when you see that, is this a child who, if you're presenting it, the parents presenting a toy or something else, the child is, joint attention, everything else, is everything else okay in terms of joint attention, in terms of eye contact, or does presenting those books in the exam room give you a little window that something else may be going on that you really might want to address? So the first thing I would say is, let's make sure that everything else developmentally is on target, and let's in fact look a little more closely. And if what you've actually got is a child who would love to do something else interactive with the parent but just isn't interested in the book, then I would say the same thing that we often say about children at any particular developmental age. I'll try it again in a month and see if he's grown into a different stage. But my first question, if you were, say, a resident who came to me with this story, would be, go back in and do a Denver, right? Let's make sure that this is not a signal that something else is askew.
And I think with that, we have wrapped up our time. I'm sure there were a few other questions, but hopefully if folks will be able to have more discussion amongst themselves. And we'd like to thank Dr. Klass for her time and her presentation, and hope to see you in Kansas City again soon.
Thank you so much.